In this tutorial, we will analyse the poem Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes. We'll have a look at some of the important context of the poem. Then we'll go through it line by line, looking at the key themes and the key ideas which are explored within the poem as they occur. And then towards the end of the tutorial, we'll also consider some of the important structure. And also we'll look at ways in which this poem could be compared to the poem Ozymandias, which also features in the EDUQAS Poetry collection for GCSE. I'll begin by reading the poem all the way through. Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes. I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed. In action, no falsifying dream between my hooked head and hooked feet. Or in sleep, rehearse perfect kills and eat. The convenience of the high trees, the air's buoyancy and the sun's ray are of advantage to me, and the earth's face upward for my inspection. My feet are locked upon the rough bark. It took the whole of creation to produce my foot, my each feather. Now I hold creation in my foot, or fly up and revolve it all slowly. I kill where I please, because it is all mine. There is no sophistry in my body. My manners are tearing off heads, the allotment of death. For the one path of my flight is direct through the bones of the living. No arguments assert my right. The sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this. Ted Hughes was a poet of the 20th century, and much of his poetry focuses on the natural world and the animals within it. To that extent, one could say that there is something of the romantic in Ted Hughes, and I mean romantic with a capital R, i.e. the movement, the literary movement of Romanticism, although do be aware that Ted Hughes is not what we would call a romantic poet. He was not living or writing at the same time that we associate with the romantic poets, which was the late 18th and early 19th century. Ted Hughes is very much a poet of the 20th century, but nature is often a key focus and a key theme in his poems. So therefore we can say that the predominant theme in Hawk Roosting is that of nature, especially the idea that nature is not always benevolent. Predators, predation and death are all part of the cycle of nature. They are all part of the natural order. It's also a poem that deals, through the character of the hawk, with themes of power and themes of control. Let's start then by looking at the first stanza. The whole poem is told from the perspective of the hawk. Therefore, because we've got a hawk thinking and speaking in a way that a human would do, Ted Hughes is using the technique of personification. He often did this in his poems. You can find many poems of Ted Hughes where animals speak and think and almost behave in quite a human manner. So this human voice with which the hawk speaks is an example of personification. You'll notice that the poem opens on the pronoun I, and we could interpret that as establishing the hawk as having an incredibly egotistical personality. He considers himself master of all that he surveys. Everything that he sees, he believes he is in charge of. I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed. He is literally the top of his food chain. At the same time, he's literally sitting at the top of a tree, and that metaphorically makes him feel that he is at the top of everything. He is the one with power. He is the one with control. I think it is important that the hawk describes the fact that his eyes are closed. One, because it suggests that He is completely in tune with his surroundings. He doesn't even need to look at his surroundings to know what's going on, to know and understand his place in the natural order. His senses are honed to perfection. He doesn't even need to have his eyes open to know what's going on. I'd also suggest that you could interpret this. His eyes are closed suggests that he feels completely secure and completely in control and is not frightened of any threat that might be around him. If this was a mouse, you wouldn't imagine that a mouse would sit there with its eyes closed, feeling completely calm and secure, because mice are not at the top of their respective food chains. They're quite low down in the food chain. They don't have, if you like, much in the way of power. The fact that the hawk sits there at the top of the tree, and of course, if you're at the top of a tree, you're in full view of everybody, and yet he can sit there or perch there with his eyes closed because he fears nothing. No one is going to prey on him. He's at the top of his food chain. He is the one in control. He's the one with power, and so he can sit there casually with his eyes closed, completely free of any worry or trouble. He has no enemies. He feels completely dominant. He mentions inaction in this stanza. Although he's currently demonstrating inaction, in other words, doing nothing, he's not idle, he's not being lazy. His mind is still sharp and focused. He might look as if he's sat there doing nothing or perched there doing nothing, but he isn't. He's listening in. He's getting a sense of his surroundings so that he can then go off and do what he needs to do as a predator. The notion of the fact that he's got a sharp intellect, a sharp intelligence, and this notion of power is emphasized in the repetition which is used in this description: hooked head and hooked feet. His head, which obviously has its beak in it, and his hooked feet, they're the tools that he uses to kill. His life is killing. So that when he's actually sleeping or when he's perched there with his eyes closed, what he's doing, he tells us, is he's rehearsing perfect kills. His mind is always on his role in nature. Even when he's there with his eyes closed, he's rehearsing in his mind the way in which he is going to kill his prey. So we could suggest he's always got death on his mind, not his own death, but the deaths of others. And the thing is, he has the power to be able to carry that out. The hooked head and hooked feet, those tools that he uses to kill, give us that impression of something very sharp and vicious and violent. This is a reminder that nature can be harsh. In nature, it's survival of the fittest. You know, when we watch nature documentaries, we often see the predators killing, the weaker animals or the lesser animals. And, many people who watch nature documentaries sit there going, oh, isn't that awful? That's terrible. Oh, the poor mouse or the poor deer. Well, that's absolute nonsense because, of course, predators need to feed on the mice and the deer or whatever it is that they eat in order to survive. This is a very unsentimental view of nature, and I think Hughes needs to be praised for that. It's unsentimental. Death is part of life. Death is part of nature, and predators have to feed in order to survive. It's survival of the fittest. A bit more about that later. In stanza 2, we have the reference to the high trees. That not only describes the preferred vantage point of the hawk, but it also symbolises his high place in the food chain and in the hierarchy of nature. He's right at the top. So his location high up is both literal and metaphorical. When he describes the earth's buoyancy and the sun's rage as being advantage to me, there is a sense that he dominates and he is aware of his dominance in the very environment in which he lives. It's almost like the earth is his to command. He believes the earth is his to command. The earth does what he wants it to do. we could interpret that as being highly arrogant, especially when he says the earth is face upwards for my inspection. Almost as if the earth is there to do what the hawk commands. The hawk looks at the earth and decides whether or not it's good and it's right and it's proper. The hawk is the one in control. He's the one doing the inspecting. Moving on to stanza 3. The hawk acknowledges that creation gave him the tools that he needs to hunt and kill and fly. But then he goes on to say that now I hold creation in my foot. That very idea that the hawk is grasping on to creation once again creates the idea of a persona in this hawk that is egotistical and arrogant, very confident and very sure of itself. I also say here that what Hughes does as a poet is he taps into a well-known narrative, the idea of the created being taking control of the creator, where the creation dominates the creator. One of the most famous stories in which the creation dominates the creator is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein creates a creature, later referred to as a monster, but he takes no responsibility for what he creates, and eventually his creation comes to dominate him, becomes the one in control and with the power. And Ted Hughes' lines here always remind me of that idea, that the hawk, in a way, has got above itself. It is so sure of itself or himself. It's so sure of the power that it has that it even believes that it completely controls creation. We could suggest that the hawk is being a little bit delusional here. Nature and creation is still very much in charge, but the hawk, through its arrogance, doesn't see that. It believes that it is completely in charge of this situation. You may notice that at the end of this stanza we've got enjambement, we've got the run-on line. Now I hold creation in my foot, which runs on to stanza 4, or fly up and revolve it all slowly. That use of the enjambement there, I think, is particularly appropriate because what it puts me in mind of is the hawk launching itself off the branch that it's sitting on in the tree and swooping down and then up in order to fly. So it's like on the page, the structure that Hughes uses through the enjambement gives you this image of the hawk taking off in order to fly and get on with its hunt. Going on to stanza 4 then, the hawk says that it can, if it chooses, revolve it, creation, all slowly. He has this casual attitude, and people who are sure of themselves and sure of their power and control don't feel the need to hurry. I can revolve it all slowly. I can take my time. I can do what I want. I am in no hurry. The hawk also suggests that there is nowhere on earth that is off limits to him. I kill where I please because it is all mine. So you get that sense of the violence of the hawk. Its job is to kill. Its role is to kill. It needs to kill to survive, and it can do it wherever it pleases because the earth is his. He is the one in control. The hawk says that there is no sophistry in my body. And I would suggest that if there's one word in this poem that you may have had trouble with on first reading, it's this one, sophistry. Sophistry is the practicing of sophisms, which are false arguments, or if you like, lies. What the hawk is saying here, there is no sophistry in my body. In other words, the hawk's saying that there is nothing false in him, in his form, in his nature, in his biology, in his role. The hawk is true to his type. He's doing what a hawk is meant to do. He has integrity. So therefore, he's just being true to himself. He's true to his role. He's doing what a hawk has to do: prey on other animals in order to survive. He reminds us that my manners are tearing off heads. That's a very graphic and violent and visceral image that emphasizes that that is what hawks do. When they kill, they do so brutally and violently, and it's not pleasant to look at. But he's a predator. That's what he's meant to do. Therefore, he is being completely true to himself and his role in nature. Hence the reason there is no sophistry in my body. Stanza 5 begins with the line, "The Allotment of Death." I'd suggest that this is an interesting and unusual description because on the surface it seems to contradict itself. In human terms, an allotment is somewhere where you grow plants. It is somewhere fertile and productive. So you would normally associate the idea of an allotment with life and growth, not death. So allotment of death seems to be contradictory. But when you consider that the hawk is doing what it has to do to survive, then the description makes sense. In order for the natural world generally to continue and to thrive, predators play an important role. Often, it's predators who kill off the weak animals and the sick animals, and in doing so, they allow the strongest animals to survive, to pass on their genes, survival of the fittest. So, I was going to say ironically, but it's not ironic really when you think about it. A predator kills in order to help nature continue and to survive. Through death, life continues. Also, as I've already alluded to, the hawk stays alive by preying on other animals. So other animals have to die in order to keep the hawk alive. And by doing that, the hawk is able to then go on and procreate and pass on their genes to allow the hawk species to continue. So through the deaths of others, the hawk contributes to the cycle of life. And I think that is what's meant here by the allotment of death. In stanza 6, the hawk notes, "The sun is behind me," and the cycle of life continues. Now, when he refers to the sun being behind him, I think we could potentially interpret this two ways, and you might spot others as well. The sun behind him again suggests that the hawk is the one in control and the one demonstrating power. In pagan religions, the sun was worshipped as a god. And so you could almost imagine that with the sun being behind the hawk has turned its back on a god. Now, if you turn your back on a god, that suggests disrespect, or it suggests arrogance, that you don't need that god, that you can survive without it. So I do wonder if this image of the sun being behind the hawk is another image of the hawk's arrogance and the fact that it believes that it is the one in control and the one with power, not creation. I've had some students in the past, and I think this is quite a good reading actually. It almost makes the hawk out to be evil in a way, because with the sun representing light, light also in literature represents goodness. And so I think there is some mileage in suggesting that the hawk is maybe evil in some way. But the only counter-argument to that is that it's not so much that the hawk is evil. Yes, it does things which are unpleasant. But remember, it's being true to itself, and it's only doing what nature intended it to do. He goes on to say, "Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this. So the hawk ends the poem as confident as he began, in complete control. I am going to keep things like this. He's not going to allow anything to topple him from his position of greatness. His self-confidence, his self-possession, his arrogance, his power are completely unshaken, and the world is his to command. Structurally, I've already mentioned the use of enjambment earlier in the poem. If you actually look at the way that the stanzas are laid out on the page, there are 6 stanzas. Each stanza is 4 lines long. We could suggest that the regularity of that structure could be interpreted as the idea of the routine of the natural order. Everything is as it should be. There's no challenge to the hawk's authority and dominance. And that routine and everything being as it should be could also remind us of the idea of the cycle of nature and the cycle of life. In what ways, then, could Hawk Roosting potentially be compared to Ozymandias by Percy Shelley? Remember that both of the poems deal with a figure which is arrogant, egotistical, and in control. In Ozymandias, it's the figure of Ozymandias, and although he himself doesn't actually appear in the poem, remember it's all about his broken statue in the desert, we have the interpretation of the expression on the statue's face. We have the words on the pedestal, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." That arrogance and that power is also present in the hawk's confidence in Hawk Roosting, and the idea that the world and creation is his to command. And if need be, well, not if need be with the hawk, he does do it. He is violent in order to survive. Remember, there are suggestions in Ozymandias by Percy Shelley that Ozymandias was a violent ruler. Remember, stamped on lifeless things from that poem suggests that one of the ways in which Ozymandias held on to his power was through violence and suppression. So there you've got a clear comparison. There are, of course, contrasts as well. One key comparison which leads to a contrast is the fact that in both poems, nature is demonstrated as powerful. The hawk is powerful in Hawk Roosting. The desert and the sands of the desert are described as powerful within Ozymandias, because remember, Ozymandias' empire has crumbled. His statue has crumbled. There's nothing left of the empire that he boasted so much about in the words on the pedestal. It's the power of nature that has taken over and has proven to be so much more dominant than man. The comparison stroke contrast here is, of course, in Hawk Roosting, the hawk is part of nature. He is part of that power that Shelley describes in Ozymandias. And another key difference, another key contrast, is that in Percy Shelley's poem, Ozymandias' power has not lasted. He is dead and gone for thousands of years. His empire is no longer viewable. You can't see it in the desert. And even his statue has crumbled to nothing. At the end of the poem Ozymandias, you get the sense of the power of nature, but the defeat of human power. The defeat of Ozymandias. At the end of Hawk Roosting, the hawk is still very much in charge. The hawk hasn't been defeated. He is still in power. I am going to keep things like this, is a significant contrast to the lone and level sands stretch far away. Nothing beside remains. You know, that idea that Ozymandias' power has not lasted, whereas in Hawk Roosting, the hawk continues to be dominant. And, as we were saying earlier, he is going to live to then pass on his genes and his power to other hawks in the future. So the power of the hawk will continue long after this particular hawk is dead and gone. unlike Ozymandias, whose only remains are a broken statue in the middle of the desert. I'm sure, if you think carefully about it, that you will find other examples of comparisons and contrasts within the poem. That's very much down to your interpretation and your evaluation, but hopefully I've given you some ideas that will start your thought processes when comparing and contrasting the ideas of power and control and nature in both Hawk Roosting and Ozymandias. So, until next time, take care.